In the 1930s, the Mexican repatriation, or the unconstitutional deportations, were implemented throughout the United States and Mexico due to the loss of job availability because of the 1929 stock market crash. A conflict developed between the Mexican Americans and the American government when Mexican American citizens were deported to Mexico. Deportations took place from 1930 up until the start of World War II for multiple reasons, which including having Hispanic features or ancestry. A compromise came in 2006 when California apologized to its Mexican American residents, and in 2010 when Texas also apologized. The Mexican repatriation was a discriminatory law that we can learn from today in how we treat our citizens.
President Donald Trump is slated to give his first presidential address to Congress today. Democratic lawmakers have begun giving their tickets away to immigrants as a protest against Trump's push to increase deportations and to block residents from some Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States. Last week, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Trump wants to, quote, take the shackles off of the nation's immigration agents.
The stock market crash of 1929 was not the sole cause of the Mexican repatriation, but it did act to accelerate the global economic collapse. By 1933, unemployment was approaching 15 million people, which was 30% of the people employed.
So, the studies I've done on the stock market of 1929 was basically the stock market grew too quickly, and people were putting all of their money into these shares for these stocks. So when it collapsed our economy, and it didn't necessarily cause the Great Depression, but it was a significant factor leading to the Great Depression, which then turned around and you have to blame somebody.
Herbert Clark Hoover was president of the United States at this time. He went from rags to riches with his engineering job, but he turned the United States from riches to rags. His motto was, American jobs for real Americans. President Hoover is greatly known for causing the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929. Many Mexican Americans and Mexicans found temporary stability in the migrant work camps established by the U.S. Farm Security Administration, or FSA. The FSA camps provided many things, such as housing, food, and medicine for migrant families.
I did not learn about it when I was in school or in high school. I learned about it when I was in law school. I took immigration law in law school, and there was about a 2-page excerpt on the Mexican repatriation.
California is the only state that teaches about these unconstitutional deportations, but it is forgotten history and should be talked about in classes, textbooks, and all parents should inform their children about this. Imagine being a kid during this time. Imagine being forced to a place where you do not know any of the people and you do not speak the language. Imagine having to be separated from your friends and family. Kids at this time were struggling, in pain, and trying to fight back to stay with their families. These children were led out of their home against their own will. Guns were pointed at them, so they had no choice but to listen and leave. Children were terribly mistreated. This is an event that needs to be discussed more in classes so that children can learn how to prevent another disaster like this one, and so that they will be knowing of what Hispanics had to go through so long ago.
In the 1930s, during the Depression, there was a lot of people that are poor and lost their belongings, lost their homes, like we did. We have a school right behind in the backyard of our home. And one day, and my father couldn't find work. He was a master in construction. And one day we came home and he told us that we were going to Mexico. My mother had become sick with TB. So he was a widower, and we were orphans of a mother. So what did I know about Mexico? I had never been to Mexico. I know my grandparents were from Mexico.
Children were bullied and were told to go back home to the U.S. and that they didn't belong. Children had to go outside and in some places had to dig holes for water. Families were homeless and often moved. Whenever their father got a new job somewhere else, they had to move there. And they had only very few things that they took with them. They were poor, so they had no money to build a new house every time they had to move.
Well, we boarded a train in the station in Los Angeles, California, downtown, and we traveled to Mexico, Gomez Palacio Durango, where my father had relatives there. He was born in what they call the Laguna de Mexico, which is the northern part of Mexico. It's about 11-hour drive from Los Angeles to El Paso, Texas. And we arrived there, but we hardly spoke any Spanish because we weren't allowed to.
Mexicans were coming back from Mexico, and people did not want them to come back. So the government made a proposal to send checks to the Mexicans so that they would stay. A man that supported this went to Mexico City to propose it to the government. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the man came back and never proposed what the U.S. government said, because everything changed after the bombing. After the bombing, American economy, American industry, and American agriculture needed Mexican workers.
So they say that history always repeats itself. Unfortunately, sometimes we cannot learn from history. I think that we should learn from history and look at other walls that were built in the world. So look at the Great Wall of China, look at the Berlin Wall. Those never benefited anybody. I don't think that building a wall, keeping out Mexicans, is just, and I don't think it's the right thing to do, not to mention the cost of building such a wall might collapse our economy.
All of the U.S. took part in the unconstitutional deportations. California and Texas were the only states that apologized. California and Texas both apologized because they were begged to. California apologized in 2006, and Texas in 2010.
During the Mexican repatriation, California repatriated an estimate of 52,946 citizens. Arizona, just over 18,000. Colorado, over 8,000. Indiana and Illinois, nearly 22,000. Responsible for nearly half of all repatriated Mexican Americans between 1920 and 1935, Texas accounts for 132,000 deportations. Although, with all the interviews we've had, these numbers are all just estimates. There is still no exact number on how many Mexican residents were repatriated. 1 to 2 million Mexican citizens were deported to Mexico. A majority of citizens went back to Mexico by their own decision, although, in total, 60% of those deported back to their home were U.S. citizens.
They became concerned because these people are coming back now to LA, and they wanted them to stay in Mexico. So they had a proposal. They were going to send them checks in Mexico to stay there. A man that supported it, he went with the proposal to Mexico City to inform the Mexican government about it. Well, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and he came back to Los Angeles with his proposal, never presented it, because the whole thing changed.
Many years after, a forced apology came. California finally apologized to all of its Mexican residents. They apologized for the fundamental violations of their basic civil liberties and constitutional rights during the years of illegal deportation and forced migration, for the suffering of their citizens of Mexican descent and their families. They apologized for preceding the Mexican repatriation program of the 1930s.